many of the Jewish merchants at that time in Germany had a, gosh, my brain is not working right now. I am sorry. I got it now. I'm sorry. I just created more work for you.
It's okay. I'll be awake. I'll be more awake once I get around to doing the editing.
Bringing you law, gospel, and guns. This is Armed Lutheran Radio.
Hi, folks. Welcome to Armed Lutheran Radio, a show about guns, hunting, competitive shooting, the natural right of self-defense, and what God's Word says about the issues surrounding gun rights and gun ownership. I'm your host, Lloyd Bailey, the Armed Lutheran, and this is episode number 195. And we're joined again by our good friend, John Bennett, the pastor at St. John's Lutheran Church in Willow Creek, Minnesota. Pastor, welcome back.
Shalom. I just gave a hint to what this episode is all about, right?
Exactly. And today, we're talking about the recent rise in anti-Semitic activity in the last few years. What should we as Christians and as gun owners think about the issue? How should we approach it? Before we get into that, though, I want to thank the members of the Reformation Gun Club for making the show possible. Armed Lutheran Radio is listener-funded, and that means we couldn't do this without your help. If you value what we do here, tell your friends, share it with your family members, your church members. Join our Facebook group, the Fans of Armed Lutheran Radio, which is growing by leaps and bounds. Leave us a review on iTunes, or if you want to support us directly in a more personal way and get access to hundreds of hours of exclusive content and some really cool Armed Lutheran swag, check out the Reformation Gun Club. Yeah, and you can also join us for a monthly online hangout, which is coming up on Friday, November 22nd. We hope you'll join us for that. We'd love to see you there. To find out more, go to armedlutheran.us/gun club and take a look at everything the Reformation Gun Club has to offer. Hope you'll join us, and hopefully we'll see you on November 22nd. All right, so we're talking about the recent rise in anti-Semitic behavior over the last few years, how we as Christians and as gun owners should approach the issue or think about the issue. The most obvious thing that comes to mind is the Tree of Life synagogue attack in Pittsburgh, which is just a little over a year ago, where 11 people were killed. But there have been some other attempted attacks in recent months. There was the one in Germany, I think. We had this crazy guy who was hoping to inspire other attacks against Jews. That was thwarted, I think, wasn't it? Because they closed the doors and he couldn't get in?
I had not heard that story, to be honest.
He tried to attack a synagogue in Halle, and they closed the doors and leaned against the doors. And then he became frustrated and ended up going next door and shooting a couple of Muslim immigrants in a shop next door or something. He was taken alive, and supposedly he wanted to inspire other people to rise up against the Jews. And then there was this attack at a synagogue in Colorado last month, or that was this month, right?
That was just a few weeks ago, where a 27-year-old had been plotting to bomb a synagogue, and what he thought were his co-conspirators were actually undercover FBI agents, and he had cased the place. He had, and they arrested him, I believe, if I remember the story correctly. It was in a hotel room where he was buying what he thought were pipe bombs from undercover FBI agents, but they were inert, and he was arrested after trying to purchase the bombs. If I remember the story correctly, I believe that's when they arrested him. But thanks be to God that they caught the scumbag.
Mm-hmm.
But I had mentioned that I had missed the story of what happened in Germany, and sadly, it's getting to the point where these types of attacks are becoming increasingly more common, and so you can't keep track of all of them. Unlike with the myth that these mass shootings are off the charts, It's not that's off the charts. It's a lot of these anti-Semitic attacks.
Right, and for every high-profile incident or attack that actually is carried out or is thwarted, like the one in Colorado, there are literally thousands, if not tens of thousands, of threats and assaults and acts of vandalism that take place around the world.
Yes, it is. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, you would think, given the wokeness of our 21st century sensibilities, and after the horrors of the 20th century, that these kinds of incidents, this bigotry, would no longer exist.
Yeah, and then you get people like Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar elected to Congress.
Right. That's the probably the most visible non-violent example of the anti-Semitism that is, I think, very rampant in our country. The left and the media that like to claim that the rise of this anti-Semitic behavior is a result of Trump, but then you turn around and you look, like you said, at Congress women like Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, and you wonder, well, did Trump get them elected?
Right.
Doesn't make sense. And recently, I looked up. There was a survey or a study by the Anti-Defamation League that had looked into this rise in anti-Semitic belief and found that it's rising worldwide, but it's the anti-Semitic beliefs are actually worse overseas, particularly Europe and Africa. And despite what the media, they like to point to the alt-right and to it's not confined just to Caucasians or to Christians in the United States. It turns out that there are actually higher rates of anti-Semitic belief among blacks and non-native Latinos and Muslims in the U.S. compared to the population as a whole. And like I said, it's especially high overseas.
But you're not allowed to say that.
I'm probably going to get demonetized or something.
Yeah. Well, and that's this crazy notion that only white people are capable of being racist. That's kind of a racist statement on its face, because you're denigrating an entire population group based on the color of their skin. But there is this, the new wokeness of this modern age, that you have to be in a position of power in order to be able to exhibit racist attitudes and actions. And so, well, because the Muslim immigrant is a minority group, well, they can't be racist because they aren't in a position of power. They don't have, the white privilege going for them, so they can't be in the class of racist individuals, which is just absolute and utter nonsense. One of the other things that you're not allowed to mention in today's day and age is that there were a significant number of white slaves, that many of the Irish people who immigrated to the United States were, in essence, sold into indentured servitude. And they were more or less slaves, even after the abolition of slavery. And so you're not allowed to mention these things, though, because, of the color of the skin of the victims in those cases. Or, it's when you talk about the racism that is exhibited by those that we would consider, quote unquote, minority ethnicities, well, that just gets swept under the rug because, they are supposed to be oppressed minority groups of people.
Right. If you're lower on the intersectionality ladder, then you can't be racist. And we don't mention the Irish in a way to sort of minimize, or to suggest that somehow slavery wasn't a bad thing or wasn't as bad as everyone tries to make it out to be. The point is that slavery, no matter who's at the receiving end of it, no matter who is selling the slave, no matter who's owning the slave, no matter the race of the slave or the slave master, it doesn't matter. It's all immoral and evil.
Absolutely.
Well, let's look at this and unwind a couple of things to get into a little bit of background here. Some of it, though, is a little bit uncomfortable, but it's something that we we should definitely get into. Let's acknowledge first, as look at it from a Christian perspective. Jesus and his disciples were Jews, right? What does the Bible,
Yes.
particularly the New Testament, tell us about the Jews?
Well, not even talking about the Jews, in general, Jesus said, love your enemies.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't even consider the Jews to be my enemies. Yes, if they're coming to break down my door and try to violate my wife and kill my children, then that individual in particular suddenly becomes my enemy. But
Right.
on the basis of our shared humanity, that's my fellow man. And so if I'm to love even my enemies, what does it say for those who aren't my enemies, but just happen to share a different ethnic heritage and a different faith than I do?
Right. The commandment tells us to love our neighbor. It doesn't say love your neighbor who looks like you. It doesn't say love your neighbor who worships like you. It says love your neighbor.
Right. And what's ironic about what you just said is that so often conservative Christians are painted by the left as those who, quote unquote, only love those who look like them.
Mm.
And yet, if you talk to your average conservative Christian, they will say, just like you have said, that we are to love all people, regardless of skin color, regardless of religion. And a lot of that comes down to our Christian notion of proclaiming the gospel to all nations. If we didn't love those people who don't look like us, we would never bother trying to share our faith with them.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, you and I were members of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, as are a good number of the listeners to this podcast. The Lutheran Church Missouri Synod has invested a significant amount of time of taking the gospel to places like Africa and Asia.
Right. We do need to acknowledge, though, that some people who call themselves Christians do harbor some kind of anti-Semitic ideas. One of the things that the Anti-Defamation League found among in their survey was those, especially those with the most anti-Semitic views, a large majority believe this notion that the Jews killed Jesus. Now that's we were talking about this yesterday, historically factual, but a bit, that's a little too, that's kind of like the whole, Major from Faulty Towers blaming all the Germans for World War II.
Right. Yeah. The way to explain that is a little more nuanced.
Right.
That from the biblical perspective, it was the Jews who, more or less through mob mentality, coerced Pontius Pilate to accede to their desire to have Jesus crucified. From the Jewish perspective, it was the Romans who crucified Jesus because he was a rebel and insurrectionist. That's the way that it is often, for example, this is the way that Ben Shapiro has the explanation that he has given on his podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And that, of course, Christians and Jews, they have different explanations as to why this is. We can say, yes, the Jews killed Jesus, but to say so isn't necessarily anti-Semitic. And so in saying that, though, at the same time, the proper Christian understanding isn't one of vengeance or hatred, but we look at those people who demanded Christ's crucifixion. And many of those, it was led by the religious leaders. And those are people that were eternally lost because of the rejection of the Messiah. And so we look at that with sorrow, that these people were lost and that their action was based out of ignorance.
How do we, when we run into people who may harbor those kinds of those views that and are still trying to blame Jews, modern day Jews, for the death of Jesus, how do we answer those people and that? How do we counter that argument?
Well, it's really simple when you think about it. The first thing is to ask them, so would you prefer that Jesus had not been crucified? That's the simple part of it, is to say that, even though we look at the death of Christ, and that's something that we should sorrow over, because in that we are reminded of our own sin, which is the reason that he was crucified at the same time. And this is, if any of our listeners are disappointed that I didn't mention this, that Christ's crucifixion at the hands of the Jews, it was to fulfill prophecy, and this was all part of our God's plan for our salvation. And so for anyone to say, let's blame the Jews for all the bad stuff that's happened to Christians because they put Jesus to death. And by the way, Christians were also persecuted after the resurrection by many of the Jewish people, particularly the Jewish religious leaders. So what? In the same vein, does that mean that a Jew then would be, a modern day Jew, would be justified in hating everybody who had just a shred of German DNA in them?
Right.
Neither one of those that hatred would be justified.
And as a matter of full disclosure, since this is Armed Lutheran Radio, we need to acknowledge that Martin Luther, in his old age, wrote some rather distasteful things about the Jews as well. When someone tries to use that fact against us, how do we as Lutherans counter that? How do we respond to those things?
Well, first and foremost, Martin Luther wasn't some sinless saint. He is a sinner just like you and me. And so if we were to hold every person on earth accountable for every untoward thing that they said, we should all just commit mass suicide at this point, because that's, the reality is that we are all guilty of saying things that we ought not have said.
Right.
There isn't a single person within the sound of my voice who hasn't had at least one thing that they've said in their life that they wish they could take back. Part of the issue, too, is that we view what Luther said and through the lens of the Holocaust.
Mm-hmm.
Just about everything terrible that is said or done to Jews in the last 100 years, and even going back to what Luther has written, is going to be viewed from that, because we can't help but see it through the lens of the Holocaust. So what Luther wrote, are those things terrible, and is it better if he had never said them? Yes, we can say that. At the same time, if you understand a bit of the historical context regarding what Luther wrote, then it does make some more sense, and you can understand how a sinner who is weak in the flesh would say such things.
Right, and it's it's not uncommon to look at older people and their ideas or classic writings and historical writings from a modern perspective, and modern cancel culture likes to say, well, you've got to reject that because this person wrote one thing or did this one thing. It's what drives the whole let's tear down all the monuments and let's take Thomas Jefferson's name off of schools and things like that. It's we're judging history from a modern with our modern sensibilities and trying to and it's throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We don't worship Luther, and just because he said one thing or wrote one thing that was, as you said, uncharitable toward the Jews doesn't necessarily mean that the other things that he wrote should be thrown out automatically. We don't practice modern cancel culture and apply that idea towards historical writings.
And at the same time, too, none of those things that Luther says towards the Jews are considered to be theological documents of the Lutheran Church.
Right.
That's not our theology.
Right.
And what's interesting, too, you talk about this cancel culture. It's more like a cancer culture, if you ask me.
Yeah.
And how will future generations judge this current point in human history? That this cancel culture, it is pushed by the radical left that tries to portray themselves as those who are tolerant, and yet they are the most intolerant people of our current day.
Well, and interestingly enough, did you see the news? Where was it? I saw just the other day one of the streaming, or maybe more than one of the streaming media services now has content warnings that You may be exposed to, traditional cultural values or something as a warning alongside the warnings about, nudity and violence and language.
Yeah, there's one that Warner Brothers put out that Disney Plus is putting this on a lot of their streaming stuff as well, and it's much more subtle with the Disney Plus, but with the Warner Brothers, and I didn't know Warner Brothers had a streaming service, but maybe it appears on some of their material that's streamed through various services, but it basically said that we were a bunch of racists back then when we made this stuff, so you'll have to ignore that part of the content.
Right, right. You might be exposed to traditional family roles and traditional values if you watch a sitcom from the 80s or something. So beware.
Yeah. I mean, the fact that within some circles that a man is considered a sexist if he bothers to hold the door open for a woman. I mean, that is the society that we're living in now.
In keeping with our beliefs as Christians, in our traditions, in keeping with what the Bible teaches us, the commandments, how are we as Christians to view our Jewish friends and neighbors, and let's not just limit it to Jews, but anyone who doesn't believe in the triune God? What is it how should we view them as Christians?
Well, the first thing that we can do is simply bear witness to the love of Christ through our actions.
Mm-hmm.
And the second thing that goes along with that is, as we get to know these people that live in our neighborhoods, maybe not in my neighborhood because I live in the middle of nowhere with a bunch of farmers surrounding me, but for those of you who live in metropolitan areas and so forth, as you get to know these people, as you are in a habit of showing them kindness, as you develop a relationship with them, that once you have gained their respect, that then behooves you to not just bear witness to Christ in your actions, but by intentional witness. To say that, if just for example, if you have a Muslim neighbor, and I think the reason why I'm using that as an example, because I think it's a little more vivid of an example, that as you are showing them love and compassion on a daily basis with just how you live your life, and you get to know them and so forth, and they know that you are a Christian, and they say, just curious, why is it that you're so kind to me when I'm a Muslim and you are a Christian? And that opens the door for you to say, well, I'm told by my Lord to love all people regardless. That we have an obligation to not be as the left stereotypes us, as those who only like those who look like us, but
Right.
to be actively loving our neighbor in whatever situation we find ourselves in. And let's refresh our memories too, that when Jesus teaches the man of who his neighbor is, he gives the example of the Good Samaritan. And the Samaritans and the Jews absolutely hated each other.
Right.
And yet it is the Samaritan who shows love to the Jew, who by ethnic definitions was his enemy, but still he loved him.
We a lot of times we think about evangelism and reaching out to the unbelieving world. A lot of times the stereotype of that is sort of the street preacher, the guy on the corner just sort of yelling at people. But the real example, the best example of how we minister to an unbelieving world is by sharing the love of God through our actions, like you said, without shouting, "Hey, I'm doing this for you because I'm a Christian and because I want you to be one too."
Yeah, as Jesus said, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. Jesus is talking there about how we live our life in view of the world around us.
All right, now a big part of what we do here on, in addition to being Armed Lutheran Radio, we are armed Lutheran Radio. We talk a lot about guns and we talk about making the case for gun ownership and self-defense with a firearm, the idea that it's acceptable for Christians, and a fair number of Christians. It would be difficult to not find support for gun rights among Christians. I think that's a fair statement. There are a fair number of Christians who agree with us. There's still a fair number, unfortunately, who don't. But in the Jewish community, it seems there's particularly strong anti-gun streak that given recent history of the persecution that the Jewish people have faced is really surprising to me. They don't have that whole New Testament love your neighbor language in the Hebrew Bible, what we call the Old Testament. And we have these pacifist Christian sects that reject the Old Testament language about violence and war. The Jews are still living under the old covenant. Why do you think there's such a strong support for gun control among the Jewish community?
I was curious about that myself, and I looked into that, and I came across the article dates back to 2008 it's called Forward Magazine, which is a Jewish publication, and it's by some guy named Eric King, who was born in 1941 in America, but he remembers the news reports about the Holocaust and so forth, and asked the question, why are American Jews so anti-gun? And he links it to a mentality that was among Jewish villages in Eastern Europe at the turn of the last century, where often people would come from neighboring towns. They would come into these little villages that were more or less communes, for lack of a better term. They would rape a few women, they might kill a man who would object and so forth, and then they would leave, and the Jews would not retaliate, even though there was enough of them that they could stand up to them, because they feared that everyone else from the town would come in and wipe them out. That was also the mentality that following the Holocaust, that we should not be like them, that weapons were seen as the tool of the oppressors of the Germans who massacred Jews in mass. And so the twofold idea of, we should not stand up to violence because there might be greater retribution toward us, as well as we aren't like those evil oppressors. And so the firearms were in many ways demonized because that was the tool of their Nazi oppressors. And
so that actually goes back to that early Old Testament idea of an eye for an eye, and retaliating. One person would kill another, and that family would then come kill a member of the killer's family, and it would go back and forth. And Jesus told us, in the New Testament, to put that stuff away. That's still very much in their minds in the Jewish community, though.
Yeah, and I think that's a big part of it. But at the same time, I think another part of it, just to be frank, is that within the United States, the significant number of those who consider themselves to be Jews are secular Jews that are very liberal in their ideology. And they are just expressing what is the general common accepted mindset among liberals within the United States. I think that plays into it quite a bit. But for those who don't identify as secular liberals, that perhaps this idea is still somehow ingrained into them culturally. But at the same time, we see how this is changing. And just as an example, we talked about the bombing that had been planned at a synagogue in Colorado, and I believe it was the rabbi of the synagogue in a public statement said, "We are not a gun-free zone here because of this exact kind of thing." And as these attacks are becoming more commonplace, sadly, thankfully that one was thwarted, that some within the Jewish community are saying, you know what, enough is enough. We have to stand up and protect ourselves. And so many of these synagogues and even Jewish schools, they will have armed security on site.
Right, and we now see high-profile Jewish people who are advocating for the Second Amendment, people like our friend Yehuda Reamer and people like the aforementioned Ben Shapiro, who are in the media openly supporting the Second Amendment and the right of individuals to protect themselves.
Yes. Yes, and the article that I mentioned, one of the closing sentences in the article is, for Jews, the phrase assault rifle is a misnomer. A correct term is Jewish defense rifle. So, so he gets it. This guy gets it, and
Hmm.
it would be great if more people will. That just because uh, you are of a particular mindset doesn't mean that you have to roll over and die for your oppressors. Just because there's a certain aspect of your culture's history, or
Yep.
or even because of a liberal mindset, because of your politics, doesn't mean that you have to simply surrender yourself to whatever would happen because somebody with evil intentions comes within your vicinity.
So let's say we've got Jewish friends in our lives, and it's you don't always go around advertising the fact that you're a Second Amendment supporter. We try to do the gray man thing and keep that unless it's someone we're very close to. It's something that we typically don't immediately share with people. How do we reach out to those within our circle of friends and coworkers who are Jewish? How do we share that interest in the Second Amendment and the idea that, you know what, this is a dangerous world, particularly if you hold certain beliefs, and you know, you have the ability in this country to defend and protect yourself and your family.
No, there's two different approaches that you could take with this. One is when you have something in the news like that attempt in Colorado, that prompts you. I mean, those kinds of things come up in daily conversation, and that prompts you to be able to have a conversation with your Jewish friends about that. The other thing is to say, just randomly, "Hey, I'm going to the range. You want to come along?" And
Right.
and if they say, "Oh, I'm not quite sure. I don't know much about guns and so forth," they say, "Well, if you want, you could come along and just watch, and if you'd like to try it out, you're certainly welcome to." And just pique their curiosity, and if they decline, then the next time say, "I'm going to the range again,"
Right.
and just say, "Hey, it's if done responsibly, it's a lot of fun. I'm more than happy to show you." Uh, just sometimes you have to be a Second Amendment evangelist.
A little gun range evangelism.
That's right. That's right. And if they decline, make sure that as soon as you come back, you run into them and they see the tremendous smile you have on your face.
Exactly. Well, before we wrap this up, there's one thing that I saw when I was doing prep for today's show that I wanted to run by you and get your take on. It was an article from CNN where the Pope had made a statement condemning anti-Semitism, and he said that anti-Semitism is neither Christian nor human. Now, while I agree with that sentiment, um, I feel the need, not just because it's the Pope, but I feel a need to nitpick this just a bit. First, as a Christian, you can't really hold anti-Semitic views, right?
Well, I would say you ought not to. And I would say
Okay.
that strongly because we are all sinners, and even there is yet forgiveness even for that. Um, But if you hold to anti-Semitic ideals and you purport yourself to be a Christian, you might want to strongly take a look at your anti-Semitic feelings and say, "Is this compatible with my faith?" Because I guarantee you, it isn't.
Right.
But there wouldn't be anti-Semitism if it were not something that the sinful human nature were capable of.
Yeah, that's where I wanted to hone in on was the not human part of it. Because isn't anti-Semitism and really all forms of bigotry, aren't they just a symptom of that sinful human nature that we all have?
Absolutely, absolutely. Uh, the Any person by nature is capable of hating. Cain killed his brother Abel with a rock. He didn't have to be taught that hatred was something that was foreign to him, and somebody had to sit there and teach him what hatred was and how to do it. It's something that came natural to him according to the sinful human nature. In the same way, hatred of all types, which bigotry is in itself, hatred, is because of the sinful human nature. And it is only through our the indwelling of Christ that we're able to overcome that. It is, and those who are not Christians, it is because of that natural moral law that St. Paul talks about in Romans 1 that's written on our hearts, that because of that, there are people who, by virtue of that natural law, will reject that hatred. And yet even the people that try their hardest to reject hatred will, at times in their life, because of sin, find themselves detesting someone.
Pastor, thank you for doing this.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure.
Folks, if you have any questions or any comments about anything you heard here today, please visit our feedback page at armedlutheran.us/feedback. You can leave us a voicemail or a voice message or send us an email. We'd love to hear from you and respond to you on the air or directly if you prefer. Be sure to tune in again next week. We've got another variety show coming your way for episode 196. We are counting down, folks. It's hard to believe that we're only 4 weeks away from Christmas and the 200th episode of Armed Lutheran Radio. So look forward to that. Hope to see you on November 22nd as well at our upcoming online meetup. Be sure to check out the Reformation Gun Club for information about that. Tune in again next week, folks, for another episode of Armed Lutheran Radio. Until then, keep shooting, keep praying. We'll talk to you next time.
John Bennett is the pastor at St. John's Lutheran Church in Willow Creek, Minnesota. For more information, visit stjohnswillowcreek.org. For show notes, be sure to visit our website at www.armedlutheran.us. Check out the Facebook page, The Armed Lutheran, or join our Facebook group, Fans of Armed Lutheran Radio. If you like what you hear, please leave us a comment on our feedback page at armedlutheran.us/feedback or a review on iTunes and let us know what you think. Thank you for listening to Armed Lutheran Radio, a member of the Self-Defense Radio Network.